But let me follow up on the last point that you were making, or one of the last points you referenced, and that had to do with the Budapest Memorandum and its potential impact on not only negative security assurances, but also the perceived utility of nuclear weapons in national security policies. And what one might do to try to mitigate the negative consequences of what I think most parties regard as a very clear violation of the Budapest Memorandum by the Russian Federation. Is it, do you think, conceivable that this action might strengthen the resolve of states to seek a legally binding treaty regarding negative security assurances? I mean, this is something that a number of non-nuclear weapon states have pushed for in the past. Clearly, there's going to be resistance from some of the nuclear weapon states. But is it conceivable, for example, that maybe the United States is somewhat more receptive to this idea going forward? I mean, I'm not terribly confident that's going to be to be feasible, but at least one could make the argument that maybe this is a lesson that one draws. Another related point, I mean, I was with a group in Delhi just a little over a week ago, and one thing that came out of the discussions, again talking about the impact of Ukraine, which really dominated the discussions of the NPT review process, was is there some way that one can try to reinforce the sanctity of international law? I mean, you're a lawyer here. The perceived need for most countries, particularly smaller countries, it's international law that they regard as their salvation. Without that, how do you function? I know Patricia Lewis in particular was suggesting that maybe some set of countries might seize upon this as a new initiative. So I'm kind of curious what you think might be possible in that regard, Axel.
Yeah, well, I think on your first question, I think that possibly, I mean, we're at a very difficult situation now with Ukraine. We don't really know how this is going to evolve. I think over the next couple of weeks we'll probably know more, and then it's probably easier to say that. But if we now hope that the Ukraine crisis that the crisis in the east around Donetsk and the eastern Ukraine will somehow be able to be controlled by Kiev, and that the emotions sort of return to an extent which makes an attempt possible to solve this in a constitutional way within Ukraine, which does not involve Russian assistance from the outside. Then I think all sides will try, as we have done many times in the past, to recreate a system where especially the US and Russia can talk, and the EU and Russia can talk about other things, and that we park the Ukraine issue somewhere at some process. And again, multilateral diplomacy is usually about, any diplomacy is usually about processes, that there is some sort of process like we've seen in the past for Georgia, where we have the Geneva process for the territorial disputes about Abkhazia and South Ossetia, where also we had this problem where we had a big issue with Russia, and we finally found a way to park the problem and thereby freeze it in this forum where the problem gets discussed, but which enables us to do business and talk about all the other things. So if we manage to do something similar with Ukraine, and the climate is one where we can talk again, I think that the nuclear weapon states will very much actually try to offer that. Because I think it is clear that after the Budapest experience, something has to come from the nuclear weapon states, some offer has to come, and I think nuclear assurances as regards the ones that you mentioned would be something. The only problem will be, will the non-nuclear weapon states, who have also, of course, had the experience of the way that the Budapest Memorandum, which was precisely that, an assurance by the nuclear weapon states, will they be interested in a treaty like that? I mean, what are they going to get other than Ukraine had gotten and then it was not fulfilled? So I see a possibility that even though now we are still the other way around, that there is demand from the non-nuclear weapon states and playing hard to get from the side of the nuclear weapon states, I think that might actually turn around within the next couple of years if we look at it from that perspective. Second part about international law. This is one of the really worrying trends that we've had over the past couple of years, the way that international law has been struggling. I'm not going to try to pinpoint where it started, this trend, but we've had a lot of instances over the past decade possibly, where we have seen the limits of international law, and also, and this is much more disturbingly, much more readiness to flaunt it on the parts of governments, and that is very worrying. Where we see that this moves on from the way that treaties are simply not upheld, Security Council binding resolutions not implemented, questions like, for example, arms embargoes, just simply are adopted but very rarely implemented by anyone who doesn't want to implement it anyway, but rarely that anyone feels constrained to do something which they don't want to do anyway. So, and then we have, for example, also Syria, the situation where these very high regarded principle of international humanitarian law and how, for example, how do we deal with the Red Cross? I mean, that is something where you would imagine that on the Red Crescent, that is something that we all consider part of customary international law. That lost, yes, some of it may be due to the fact that these are non-governmental entities fighting there. They're rebels, they shoot at whatever moves, you could argue it that way. But in general, sort of there is no interest also, we feel, on the Syrian government side really to uphold international humanitarian law. So here we have a failure on very many fronts, and this was another one. And here we've had violation of the UN Charter with the annexation of Crimea. Not that much. I mean, there were 100 states who condemned it in the UN General Assembly. That's good, but that's just barely half. And so that is a worrying trend. If there's a counter movement to do something, I'm sure we'll be there, and I think it would be definitely worth it. Yeah, for that.
Thanks. Okay, so, Tom, you want to identify yourself?
Sure. Tom Graham, a first-year student here at the Non-Proliferation Terrorism Studies program. Most of my question is about coalitions, the 2010 review conference. So I was in Dr. Potter's simulation class last semester, and I was South Africa, and obviously coalitions like the New Agenda Coalition and NDPI have played large roles in the past, 95, the 2000 review conference. What role did they play at 2010? It sounded like you said that Egypt played a large role as the chair of the NAM, but what role did they play, and what role do you expect they'll continue to play in the future?
I think did they also chair NAC?
They chair NAC.
They chair NAC as well.
Sorry.
No,
No,
but
they
Egypt
also
at the time,
chair-
Oh, yeah, that's right.
They,
That's the rep,
they
yeah.
spoke on behalf of NAM, NAC, and themselves.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So they were a multi-chair. That was no. Good question. It was interesting to see that, in fact, Egypt, since they controlled both the NAC and the NAM, made a very conscious decision to forget about NAC, focused on NAM. And that meant that we had also here moved into a more antagonistic thing, because NAM is a political body which is not really a body which sort of is used to find consensus. It is a body to demonstrate strength, and to NAC is a body which was used, but again here you see this from a much longer term perspective, so you might want to come in, but which traditionally had the role of building compromise where the various sides could then end up joining in. But this wasn't the case then. No, Egypt used the NAM as a group of strength. And it was the only group that really was there. The P5 were at that, and in 2010, still very much united. But they are an interesting group. They They are united in the disarmament and the front, and they are united to some extent in the non-proliferation front. But it is not something where they will, be a very strong group per se. They will have red lines that they will agree on among each other, and then will hold the red line of the other. But it's not a group that is very visible out there. There's the EU, which is a group which has a particularly interesting setup because we have two nuclear weapon states and, for example, two adamantly anti-nuclear states, one of them both on the disarmament and the peace for use, that's Austria. And with Ireland, you have a very tough champion on disarmament. A very difficult group to find a common position. EU tries to find common positions, and very much an indicator of where maybe an outcome might be, because if Ireland and France can agree on the nuclear disarmament on some language, it's quite likely that the bigger room can also agree. So there was a certain role for the EU, but not a particular one. No, my feeling was that the traditional role of groups that had been there before was much less in 2010, and that the only group you really felt was the NAM.
Thanks. Masako and then Simon.
Hi, Ambassador. Thank you so much for very informative lectures, and also I really would like to express my appreciation for Austria, the very strong initiative in disarmament. I'm originally from Japan. I have a very, very strong sentiment with the disarmament issues, especially humanitarian impact of the use of nuclear weapons. And in that sense, I'm so happy to see that Austria is taking a really strong initiative. And my question is, in fact, this initiative is getting more momentum. So that is true, but at the same time, as we all observed at the Nayarit conference, that very strong statement, which is not problem to me, but a strong problem to some countries, such as Japan, my country. And Japanese Foreign Ministry announced, we have to reconsider how we would be involved in this process right after the Nayarit conference. So my question is and I really hope this humanitarian initiative is going to be the driving force to lead to the nuclear free world, but at the same time I see this kind of a dispute among these humanitarian. So I would like to know your opinion how this is going to play out toward the 2010. 2015. Sorry. Yeah.
But I think thank you. That's a very, very good and very complex question, because I think on the disarmament front, this will be very much one of the key questions on how to deal with it. And it reminds me a little bit of back leading up to 2010. The big question was at that time the Nuclear Weapons Convention. Will it be in or out of the? And that was the big thing. At the end, it was in. But it didn't really change much. It didn't come to that much. It didn't have the impact that those who warned or those who argued in favor had actually made out of it before. So my recommendation to everyone would be is just to play it cool and to see it's much less important about whether you name something in the document or not, or whether you have this sort of process included. So that would be my recommendation to my successors. But I think what you say is very true. I mean, I think we were all surprised that there were 146 states in Mexico at the Nayarit conference. That was much more than we had thought would come. And yes, it's sort of taken off, and I think that the Mexican hosts were a bit carried away at the end by the very sort of enthusiastic support that they heard. And that, in a way, they're summing up, and their conclusion then has made it a bit more challenging now for us who are organizing the next conference, the follow-up conference in I think it will be December in Vienna. And we are now currently involved in the process of explaining exactly what the goals are for Vienna, and that those will be very much in line with what the original idea was. And the original idea, I think that's something that we also have to realize, that I mean, we've had this crisis of narrative in the nuclear disarmament field. We don't really have a lot of people believing that there will ever be nuclear disarmament. And that is, I mean, I'm not sure in this room we can ask who really thinks that nuclear disarmament will happen. We know it's possible. There are experts who've been doing research for decades who say it is possible. You can do it. It's not that it's not possible. But will it, nevertheless, there also, everyone, including the nuclear weapon states, agree that it is necessary. Because everyone knows that long term, this deal that Bill always says, you know, the NPT is a balance. Those states, the non-nuclear weapon states, promise they will not acquire nuclear weapons precisely because the other side promised nuclear disarmament engagement. So it's part of that package. It has to come. But nevertheless, most people don't believe it ever will happen. And that it is a problem because we don't believe it will happen means that our governments don't invest time, they don't invest resources into making it happen. You very rarely find a leader today, a political leader, who will go out there and say, I am in favor of eliminating nuclear weapons. It's very, very rare. Very few people say that. It's not particularly, you know, it's not going to happen very quickly. It's obvious. You're not going to be able to use it in any tweet or on your Facebook page. There will be no sexy photo ops next to, you know, something. It's just not going to be out there. And there are so many other priorities now. Why would you focus on this? Why would you throw your political career behind this issue, nuclear disarmament? So there is a real problem on the sort of the narrative that we've had. And also the narrative comes from the 60s, 70s, when there was the strong movement, but it didn't succeed, and now we don't have a new story to tell. It's telling the same story nowadays to the same people, the one that was told in the 60s, 70s. It doesn't really make a lot of it doesn't convince people, and that's where the humanitarian approach comes in again. That works. We've seen that works. You've had cluster munitions campaigns, landmine campaigns. These campaigns focused on one issue. The issue was there are weapons that can cause such harm to humans that it is beyond something that we could tolerate. We must not allow weapons that cause such terrible harm beyond the objective of any war. So by phrasing that and by saying, okay, landmines are outlawed because they can harm civilians. Cluster bombs are outlawed because they can harm civilians. Biological weapons, chemicals, they're all outlawed because they can harm innocent civilians. Well then, why shouldn't nuclear weapons be outlawed also? Because they harm innocent civilians much, much more than a landmine can. So this is a new way of looking at it. It's not necessarily a unique one, and people have looked at it from that way very much from the start, and there's a reference to humanitarian in the NPT itself. So it's been out there. That's the reason why we are concerned about nuclear weapons. It's because they can create this huge harm. But it's not gone into the whole advocacy movement and all of that. And presumably if we manage to create this humanitarian approach, maybe we can create a mindset, bring young people again into the whole effort and try to win again people to make them understand, look, there's potential harm out there. And that's why I think this approach is so relevant and so necessary. Because if we don't manage to bring something in that area again, if there's no progress on nuclear disarmament, we're going to eventually lose out on the non-proliferation as well. It's just simply going to disappear.
Thanks. I see Simon and Sadiqa, and okay, let's maybe what we'll do. Let's go ahead and collect maybe 3 questions, and then you can respond as you see fit. You want to start, Simon?
Okay, I'll try it short. Simon Tower, I'm also a fourth-year student in non-proliferation therapy studies, and I was also in Dr. Potter's simulation class last year. I was chairing the disarmament working group.
Good for you.
So, I wanted to actually follow up on what Masoka said and what you mentioned before about humanitarian consequences, because I think this is a vital part in actually ever getting the chance of achieving global zero. So just because of what happened or what's happening in Ukraine right now, I think you mentioned that a lot of non-nuclear weapon states right now are losing confidence into negative security assurances and also these kind of nuclear barrels. So if that happens, and wouldn't that kind of potentially really create a kind of a black or white world, which is either humanitarian consequences with Mexico finally gotta pursue a push in the right direction, and non-nuclear weapon states like Austria certainly very much try to push this kind of factor. And you have something happen like in Crimea or in Ukraine that could kind of diminish or kind of really destroy all the effort in that direction. Isn't that the side that this black and white world could kind of come back in that sense?
Okay, Senator, thank you. I think, Sadia, and you might introduce yourself as well.
I'm Sadia Disting from Islamabad, Pakistan, and I'm a visiting fellow here at CNS.
It will be actually also on the CNS NGO delegation to the PrepCon. So we're expanding our...
But my question doesn't really pertain to NPT. This is a very informative talk, and thanks for that. My question relates basically to the outliers to NPT. So you talked about incentives for nuclear weapon states to disarm. What in your view would be the right ways to engage the NPT outliers to disarm? Because for at least two of them, nuclear weapons are as what they consider as the great equalizer to not only against the nuclear weapon states, but also against states that would have conventional military superiority. And even if their adversaries disarm, they might eventually see some advantage in having or retaining nuclear weapons to ensure that there is this kind of balance that ensures their security and all. How could we, or what incentives could we generate to convince them to disarm?
Thank you, and I think Beatrice, I'll give you the
Hi,
floor.
I'm Beatrice Finesci. I'm also a first-year student. I was also in Dr. Potter's simulation representing Iran. I'd like to ask you on what your opinion is on the current standing of U.S.-Russian relations in regards to Iran and how they will be addressed in the case of the fact that they're only halfway through the joint plan of action, moving forward through NPT and into July, where the joint plan of action is ended, and the next stage of this negotiation has to come up. Many speculate that it might be used as a playing card to upset each other, possibly as leverage. What are your opinions?
Okay, why don't we try to...
Okay. Okay. I'll start with Simon. Very briefly. No, you are right that the sort of the development in Crimea could throw us back into Cold War. We could actually have again the narrative of the 50s, 60s re-emerging. I can tell you, colleagues of mine in Brussels who work in the other organization there in NATO are jubilant with it. That's overdoing it. No, I mean they are very energized by what has happened, because now they are taking out of their desks, the drawers, the plans of the 80s that they had as regards sort of Russian tanks rolling in from the east, and the border is a bit further east, but it's still the same sort of scenario. And we may once again, hear all this talk about nuclear and the imminence of a nuclear strike and mutual assured destruction and all that. That may happen, but I doubt it, because I think there's a whole new generation. I mean, look at yourselves. I hope you're not going to go and accept that. And we have, as you know, in Austria, a very young foreign minister. He's 27. And he has said very clearly that he's not going to accept the Cold War thinking anymore. It's not an option. He says this is a new generation. We have read our history books, and we are not going to play along. So I hope very much that this is your life and your world, and you're going to stand up and not accept that. That's my hope. But I think also, it is important to stress always that It is precisely because of these dangers, they do exist, and it is precisely for that reason that the nuclear weapon states, it is in their immediate interest to offer disarmament from themselves in order to avoid that, because they yes, perhaps they feel very comfortable in this world where they remain the sort of the five official, and coming to your official nuclear weapon states, the NPT nuclear weapon states, and where much hinges on threat, etc. But I think they must also understand that in a world where technology moves around the world so quickly and knowledge moves around very quickly, the possibility of breakouts happening simultaneously all over the place is very possible. And I think with every month that there is no progress on disarmament, the more the interest rises, because the lesson out there is the nuclear weapon states are not getting rid of their nuclear weapons, and that has to have a reason, because they need it, because it protects them. Therefore, we want them as well. So I think it's up to them to show the leadership here and just simply say, and also in their interest, and it would be in their interest, to start disarming, and thereby take away some of the interest in acquiring such weapons. Incentives for the outliers. Yeah, well, I have to say it's very difficult to give incentives to states as powerful and strong and eminent as, for example, the ones in the one of India and Pakistan, who are facing each other more or less with nuclear weapons. Now, what can you offer these states? First of all, it's very difficult because both of these states very, very strong belief that nuclear weapons gives them status, nuclear weapons give them stability among themselves, and also certain dominance in the region. And how you can offer them anything on these three fronts is going to be very difficult. On the status, again, I mean, I keep repeating myself now, but I think that the only thing you can offer as a nuclear weapon state, from the NPT-5, would be to start disarming and to invite them to join. I would think that if anything we can try to do is open up the NPT to include them, not in the NPT because they won't join for understandable reasons, but what they might do is they might join in NPT follow-up programs of disarmament, where all states that have nuclear weapons could be invited to join in and to contribute on an equal footing. On regional status, I think, frankly, if you look at both of these states, well, there is China. That is a strong regional player. But I frankly think even with a nuclear imbalance, I think neither Pakistan nor India are small, unimportant countries with or without nuclear weapons. So I think in a regional context, I think there should not be as much concerns. What might help there is a regional organization, such as in Europe with the OSCE, where you have a regional organization, a security organization which has nothing to do with nuclear weapons or sort of getting rid of nuclear weapons, but which creates security and understanding and a forum by which you can work out things.
There's a question of the interim agreement in Iran and
yes.
Import.
Well, that actually, Iran is one of the positive things, which I thought I said at the beginning for 2015. We have worries about Ukraine and worries about the non-conference, the conference not happening on the Middle East. But I think Iran is actually a very positive story. It was the big issue, sort of the big conflict issue in 2010. This time it has the potential of becoming the big sort of success story. If there is an agreement between the P5+1 and Iran, if there is a negotiated solution on that, I think that's going to be one of the big success stories. And I think that will be, that will be one of the possibly few points that everyone will point to, that it is possible to discuss and to negotiate multilaterally on the non-proliferation field. However, of course, that requires an agreement, and you said by July. I think it's hard to say at the moment if we're going to have this agreement. My take on this is the following: I think that the way that the negotiations are running is very good. On both sides, we have very good, very committed Iranian negotiators. This is new. This is since Rouhani. We have on the other part very committed and, interestingly, also regarding, for example, Russia and the EU partners among the P5+1. On that part, also a very committed group that wants an agreement. So I think we may have an agreement in July. What I don't know is whether it will be possible on the P5+1, especially on the US side, to ensure that this agreement will be implemented and will go through Congress. And at the same time, I'm not sure whether it will be possible for the Iranian president to convince his parliament to adopt something that, for example, the US Congress does not act on, but just sort of doesn't really act it on, but which the EU, for example, and Russia and China all implement, but the US drags out doesn't happen, as we've sometimes known the US Congress to do. It doesn't get ratified. Then what will happen on that side? Will the parliament in Tehran also ratify this agreement? So we may have a point in July, and that is 9 months before the next, or 10 months before the next, before the RevCon. What happens then? And I think then we will be in a difficult phase, possibly, where we agree to come together again and to try to see if we can find a better outcome, or an additional outcome, or an additional direct something or other. In any case, I think it may be a very fragile situation where all sides will try not to create any emotional bad blood or any reason for one side to be very unhappy. So I think even though we may not have, if we have an agreement, perfect, then it will be celebrated. If we don't have an agreement, I think we may have a very careful, very sort of fragile situation where everyone will be very careful not to upset it.
Lily,
Yes, I'm Lily Bucaro. I'm also a first-year student in the MPTS program. And I should probably announce my bias before I ask my question. I represented China in the Disarmament Working Group, and I'm an American, and I study Russian policy quite extensively. So, you've mentioned the humanitarian consequences movement a lot during your discussion today, which is a movement that I'm personally very interested in, but of course I also understand the P5 views regarding it. Do you think that this movement is going to attempt to dominate the conversation with it? Well, not dominate, but be a forceful presence in the conversation in the Disarmament Working Group? Do you think that this is a positive approach to take with the P5? And then also, in addition to that, do you envision the Vienna Humanitarian Consequences Conference, which is happening right before the 2015 Review Con, do you envision it as a way to try to incorporate the P5, or do you think it'll continue along its trend of holding their meetings regardless of whether or not the P5 want to join?
Well,
we'll take one more question. I think
Sure.
this will be probably the last question, and then we'll try to wrap up close to two. Ben, you want to introduce yourself? And then
My name is Benjamin Pack. I'm a fourth semester NPTS student. Also played the role of South Africa in the simulation course.
wow, big delegation. How big was the Austrian delegation?
we had two Pakistanis who were very good.
My question concerns the 2010 language, which, while not explicitly pointed to the issue of tactical nuclear weapons for the first time, and I'm wondering, how did sort of interested states come down on that issue in 2010? What were the red lines? And given U.S. and NATO's interest in engaging Russia on that issue since 2010, but to no avail, obviously, as well as the situation in Ukraine, how the U.S. and some NATO members might be willing to show greater willingness to push the issue, or at least flexibility on the issue going forward.
And if Ambassador Marschik is so inclined, he might wish to hint at least about his interactions with the Russians with respect to your draft statement in subsidiary body one where that issue, I think, surfaced. You may not want to comment on that, but since I wasn't going to ask it, but since Ben raised the question of non-strategic nuclear weapons, I think you have some personal experience in that regard.
Yeah, well, I had mentioned the death threats already, so I thought that we would not get into that again anyway. No, okay. First, on the humanitarian consequences that I keep returning to, but also because there are lots of questions, not necessarily because I'm trying to push this issue that strongly. It's just that it has created a lot of interest. That's and I gather also here. I mean, I think. Again, I'm not running this. I will be watching it from the outside with a lot of interest and a lot of relief that I'm not going to be involved this time. But if I were there, I would try to make sure. And I mean, I am in touch with my colleagues, obviously, in the ministry in Vienna. I think there will be a very conscious attempt to demonstrate also to the P5 by hosting a very responsible conference in Vienna that this approach, the humanitarian approach, is not something new and directed against the P5, that it is not something that is trying to undermine other fora and other processes, that it is not at all in any way against what is happening in the NPT, and it is absolutely not against the CD in Geneva, even though you can hardly be against the CD because the CD isn't doing anything. So frankly, there's. But in any case, it is not trying to be antagonistic or in confrontation to the P5, but it is just logical that within the NPT and within the CD, it is very clear that the issue of nuclear disarmament pits the P5 against the rest. It's just the way it is. And the P5 have standing sort of behind them in their shadow or perhaps in their umbrella a couple of other states who will try to sort of work in order to demonstrate understanding for the interests of maintaining nuclear weapons. It's hard for me to predict what the position would be of this group. I don't think it's a group. I don't think that the 146 states that came to Mexico are a group. They would not consider themselves at all a group. So there will be in my view, there will be no sort of group formation, group statement, group presentation. I think there will be a number of states, I would hope, that would try to raise the issue of the impact of a nuclear weapons explosion, of the potential impact and the devastating and the magnitude of such an impact, and that we must all work together to avoid that. And that's precisely the movement. And if you want to call this, label that somehow, I think Austria would be perfectly fine as not having the word humanitarian in there at all, as long as we manage to put in this prospect of working harder in avoiding that this happens, and in realizing that there is the potential to create terrible injury to humans. However we formulate that we can leave that open. There's no sort of text, but we think it is the one way we can possibly, redirect focus on this issue ahead and possibly thereby prevent something from happening, an accident. The tactical nuclear weapons. Well, frankly, no, I'm not. No. No, it is a very touchy subject, and it was very difficult negotiations. And I mean, it was something that both the And I mean, I can say all sides had very, very committed, very determined positions going into the conference, and nothing whatsoever changed the attitude of any of them during the conference. I think, I mean, what are the expectations for the next round, and what is the impact that's happening now? I think that's just too early to say. Maybe in 3 weeks, 4 weeks, once we find out whether, I mean, if the Ukraine really sort of turns out to be this terrifying moment which throws us back into Cold War times, then I think all bets are off, and I'm not at all sure what the NPT RevCon in next year is going to look like. I think then we're in a bit of a different world. It's very, very hard to work on such an assumption. But what do we all hope, somehow we can sort of draw it all back in, I would expect very much that we would be having the same negotiations again as we did in 2010. I'm very surprised if we are in a new world.
Axel, let me, thank you for taking time away from your family and your vacation to visit us today. I hope that the next time you return that you stay for a longer period. We already have a sign prepared, you saw it on your door, which we will retain, and we would be delighted to have you kind of translate your superb presentation into some written product. So we really look forward to that return, but in the meantime, please join me in thanking our very distinguished speakers.